Hello everyone, and welcome back to another special bonus episode of the Insidious Agenda podcast. I'm your host Nick, and I hope you're having a wonderful, spooky season. On this special bonus episode, we're going to explore the story of the White Lady of Hohenzollern Castle. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn down your lights and listen in, for our special bonus episode is coming up. Stay with us. On the top of Mount Hohenzollern in Baden-Württemberg stands Hohenzollern. The current iteration is the third that was built on that site. Though there were many shifts in the way the Hohenzollern dynasty was laid out over the course of the centuries, they have stood as the ruling family of Prussia for over 400 years. They were the first electors of the major religious and political body known as the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, and the dynasty complete would remain intact through World War I, with the death of Kaiser Wilhelm II giving way to the Weimar Republic. There still exists, to this day, two princes who can be tied to the former Royal Prussian line of the family. The castle was first constructed in the early 11th century and stood for hundreds of years. It was destroyed in the year 1423, after suffering an attack from free cities of the province of. The second building would take place from 1454 until 1461 and became a refuge for Catholic members of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The castle was of great strategic importance during the period known as the 30 Years' War, and eventually would lose that importance by the late 1700s. The castle became dilapidated, and many of the buildings of the castle had to be torn down due to the lack of upkeep and disrepair. Only a few decades after the second building of the castle was torn down, the castle was rebuilt to how it exists today. It was constructed over a period of 21 years, from 1846 until 1867, as a memorial to the family by the living scion, King Frederick William IV of Prussia. It was constructed in English Gothic Revival style and was inspired by the chateaux of the Loire Valley in France. Each year, the castle attracts approximately 350,000 tourists and has garnered a reputation for being haunted. The legends of those Hohenzollern family members who have witnessed the spirit of a white lady walking about are frightening to their family. She has been witnessed by members of the Hohenzollern dynasty over the course of centuries. But the question begs to be asked, who is she? And how did she get the nickname, the Hohenzollern Harbinger? For that answer, we'll have to look at her story a little bit more closely. The earliest recorded sightings of the White Lady have been written since as far back as the 14th or 15th centuries. She was seen walking around the ramparts of the castle, or could be seen on the very highest points of the mountain itself. She is described as wearing a long, white veil and is often seen with a cluster of roses on her shoulder. She carries with her a large bunch of keys. It was said that she knew where the great treasure of Nibelungen was hidden and would roam the mountainside, knocking on parts of the mountain. Mysterious doors would open and onlookers would be able to catch flashes of gold and jewels. The theory of who this spirit is usually points to one of two people. The first is that of the Countess Kunigunde of Orlamunda. It was said the Countess had fallen deeply in love with a man named Albrecht of Zollern and Nuremberg. Unfortunately, her affection towards him was not returned. He was recorded as telling her that he could not marry her because there were 4 eyes in the way. The Countess believed that he was speaking of her 2 sons that she had from a former marriage. This statement enraged her. She could not believe that this was the only obstacle standing in the way of her being married to her beloved. In her mind, there was only one thing she could do: remove the obstacle. The Countess murdered her 2 sons, killing them by stabbing them in the head with a golden needle at the end of a spindle. This would only cause her more grief, as the 4 eyes that Albrecht was referring to were those of his 2 brothers. It can realistically be believed that had he truly had an affection for the Countess, then the opinions of his 2 brothers wouldn't have mattered. Once Albrecht found out that the Countess had murdered her sons because of this, he turned away from her in horror and disgust. From a broken heart of the love of her life leaving and the death of her children, the Countess would pass away, having been overcome with shame and remorse. She fled to the Vatican in Rome and begged for forgiveness and absolution for the sins that she committed. Depending on how her story is told, determines what happens next. In some, the Pope would order her to build a monastery and live out her days there, dedicating and devoting her life to prayer. She would crawl on her hands and knees from Plassenberg to the valley of Berneck and was to establish a monastery. If this was true, it was a journey of some 400 to 500 kilometers. In an alternative version, it was said she became an abbess of the Cistercian convent that was located at Himmelsthrone. The Cistercian story seems to be the more believable and is more closely tied to how she appears now, as it was their custom to wear an all-white dress. There's also a third story known, that she may have been sentenced to life in prison for murder, or that she passed away while on a pilgrimage. The Countess's death was recorded as 1351. Some historians today refute the legend of the Countess entirely. The main reason being that the Countess of Orlamunde had never had any children. With a strong wave of emotions that she experienced and the circumstances preceding her last days of seclusion, the Countess returned to haunt the halls of Albrecht's castle until he passed away in 1361. The legend of the Countess was passed down from generation to generation and eventually made its way to the castle of Hohenzollern, which, as it turns out, was the ancestral center for the Counts of Orlamunde. The second theory, which comes from the Bohemian historian known as Balbinus, is that she is the apparition of a woman named Perchta von Rotzenberg. Perchta's father, Ulrich II, ruled over parts of Bavaria. In 1449, she was forced into a marriage with John of Liechtenstein, who was of Hohenzollern blood. This marriage, like most at the time, had various political and financial implications. Ulrich neglected to pay the dowry for his daughter, causing John to take out his anger and frustrations on Perchta. He would abuse her ruthlessly, beating her over and over. There was no port in a storm for Perchta, for no help would come. She wrote to her father, begging to be rescued from the torment she suffered, but unfortunately, not much could be done. For at this point in history, husbands had the right to beat their wives as much and as they saw fit. Perchta even had to beg her own mother-in-law for food, as she was not given any. Her husband wanted nothing to do with her, and the rest of the family fought with her as often as they could. John ignored his wife during courtly appearances, disrespecting her presence in every way. John was also a bit of a playboy and would bring mistresses into their bedchamber and organize orgies within their castle. Even John's sisters would terrorize Perchta. Her father would eventually turn on her, stating that her behavior was simply a cry for help for not being loved enough. Eventually, Ulrich relented and paid the dowry for his daughter, but this would change nothing for Perchta. She was forced to endure a loveless life of torment for 20 years until the death of her father in 1469. Legend has it that on his deathbed, Ulrich apologized for his behavior and asked forgiveness of his wife, which she refused him. To make matters worse, before he passed, Ulrich would curse Perchta for his wife refusing to forgive him. He would curse her to not have rest even after death. After he passed, her brothers rescued her and brought her home. The curse unfortunately came true, and she passed away, only to return to haunt the Hohenzollern dynasty. She became the Harbinger, as her specter would appear at certain times, which normally forebode death or disaster. In the early 15th century, Hohenzollern Castle was inhabited by a powerful count known as Friedrich the Ettinger. Friedrich had begun to grow jealous of the free cities in their empire, so he was forced to take up iron against them. The combined might of the cities of Württemberg united against him and begun to attack the mountain of Zollern. On a dark evening, the White Lady appeared, walking about the ramparts of the castle, weeping and wringing her hands in agony. Hearing of the legend, Friedrich knew that doom and death would follow. On the 15th of May in 1423, the castle was captured by the attacking forces. A heroic story came out of this, however, as Count Friedrich's wife, known as the Maid of Mossinger, would disguise herself as the White Lady and bring supplies each night from the valley of Hechtingen to the castle, allowing it to withstand the assault longer than it should have. As the centuries moved on, surviving members of the Hohenzollerns would always look for the appearance of the White Lady. She would appear to members of the Franconian branch in 1486 at Plassenburg. In 1564, she was witnessed by George Frederick, and in 1877 by Philip Erdmann. Even the great Napoleon Bonaparte would, in a way, encounter her spirit. He defeated the Prussians in battle in 1806 in the province of Bayreuth. In 1812, Napoleon traveled to the former Bayreuth palace of the Hohenzollerns and spent a night. It was said that Napoleon was so disturbed by what he experienced that night, he packed up and left the following morning. On his way out, he referred to it as Le Maudit Château, or the Cursed Castle. One of the most well-known appearances of the White Lady was the foretelling of the death of Frederick I. While he was recovering from an illness, he was sitting in a chair one evening in the Palace of Berlin. He noticed the door open with no noise and watched as a white-robed figure glided into the room and extended its arms outward to the king. Frederick was overcome with terror as he knew this was the White Lady. As history would have it, this was actually his wife, Sophia Charlotte, who suffered from mental illness. The shock of belief that this was the White Lady harmed his system to the point that he passed away only a few months later. The White Lady also appeared in 1840 to foretell the death of Frederick William III. In July of 1857, she would arrive again to predict the death of another Hohenzollern family member. This appearance and story has been recounted on the website Prince Michael's Chronicles, which I'll read to you now. In July of 1857, King Frederick William IV of Prussia and his queen were on their way to the springs of Marienbad when they stopped in Saxony. When they stopped to visit the king and queen, who were not only cousins, but friends. At that time, the Saxony court was at the summer residence of Pillnitz Castle, where the royal couple were staying. The night following their arrival, the weather was bizarre. Nothing moved, not a single leaf, and the river was still. The moon shone to a certain height above the ground that was cloaked in a strange fog. A fog no taller than 1.5 meters, yet it covered all the alleys and lawns of the park. The clock had just struck 1 in the morning, and a total silence reigned when a soldier, standing sentry at the door at the corner of the palace, heard from afar the steps of several people. The steps were steady but heavy, as though the characters he could not yet see were soldiers. Soon, the sentry was able to distinguish a kind of group that appeared as 5 silhouettes advancing slowly towards him. The first was a woman dressed entirely in white, ahead of 4 men holding a very heavy and very long object. The sentry became terrified when he saw them come into view, for the 5 people had no heads. Terrified and frozen with dread, the sentry couldn't move or scream. The horrific procession walked past him and entered the palace from a small side door and disappeared. The sentry, having regained some composure, wondered what to do. Should he sound the alarm? Had he gone mad? Did he dream it? Did he just imagine it all? Perplexed and still trembling, distraught and disoriented, he didn't know what to do. The small palace door opened again, and the same terrifying and sinister procession reappeared. This time, the woman in white preceded the still headless men. They passed so close to the horrified sentry, he could see that what they were carrying was an open casket in which a man lay covered in ornaments. The soldier recognized the Order of the Black Eagle the highest badge of honor in the Prussian kingdom. Only, the corpse laying in the casket did not have a head. In its stead, a royal crown was placed between the corpse's shoulders and the casket. The sentry trembled all over. He was again paralyzed in fear and not able to scream or move. The procession, with their steady steps, was slowly getting further away from him. In the meantime, the fog that had covered the ground slowly lifted, and the 5 headless characters disappeared. The last thing the sentry saw was a moon ray illuminating the crown and the casket. After that, he saw nothing. The Hohenzollern kings of Prussia, since time immemorial, knew that the White Lady usually appeared at the royal palace in Berlin to announce the death of a family member of the dynasty. This time around, the White Lady predicted yet another drama. During his stay at Pillnitz, the King of Prussia suddenly began experiencing symptoms of a terrible illness that would soon strike. 3 months later, on October 8th, a hemorrhagic stroke would leave him incapacitated. The madness was so apparent that the regency had to be assumed by his younger brother, Prince William, who hated the idea of taking his older brother's throne, for he loved him dearly and did not want to seem like he was stealing his throne. But the situation called for this drastic measure. For 3 years, the unlucky king remained mostly in a vegetative state. His madness had intermittent moments of increasingly rare lucidity until finally he fell back into the obscurity of his madness for good. His death on the 2nd of January in 1861 was a deliverance. The death that 3 years earlier the White Lady had so clearly announced. One of the last recorded sightings of the White Lady came in the year 1914 with the onset of World War I. It was said that she appeared to the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which would of course foretell his assassination shortly thereafter. When the German Empire was defeated in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the last ruling Hohenzollern, would abdicate his throne. Once there were no longer any Hohenzollern rulers, the White Lady was finally able to be at peace, and she has never appeared in a Hohenzollern castle since that time. Whether she existed as the Countess, whose great love went unreciprocated, or Perchta, who was cast aside by everyone she loved, the stories of the White Lady are tragic. It's incredible to see how her appearances mark the deaths of members of the Hohenzollern family. It's hopeful that with the abdication of the final ruler of the family in 1918, that the White Lady, the harbinger of the Hohenzollerns, was finally able to rest and be at peace. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of our special bonus episode about the White Lady, the harbinger of the Hohenzollerns. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about the podcast and our socials, please visit the link tree in the show notes. Before you go, remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the exciting episodes we have coming. We'll be back with you again on Tuesday for our regular weekly episode, on which we'll tell the now famous story of the Perrin family and the demonic infestation that inspired The Conjuring. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.